Hello, everyone. Welcome to the second live session of our course. For those of you who are with me right now, thank you for joining me. For those of you who will be watching this session at a later time, thank you for making the time to go over this. We have 1 hour, and I have an interesting list of questions that I'd like to try to answer. Let me start by saying that, again, like the last time, we have a number of very thoughtful and insightful questions. I really appreciate that. That to me means that many of you are taking the content of this course seriously. They're learning from the content, and as a result, your understanding goes up, which should generate new questions. And this is exactly what seems to be happening. So I'm very delighted to see this. Okay, so let's start with the questions. And again, if during this presentation, if you have additional questions, you can type it in, and my colleagues who are with me here will let me know. All right, so the largest number of questions on this list relate to emotions and the connection between emotions and culture. And as you know by now, this is really a very important issue in cross-cultural communication. So, question number 1. To what extent do you believe that human emotion is shaped by biology or by culture? I'm going to start answering this question by explaining the difference, or one of the differences, between natural sciences, such as chemistry, and social sciences, such as management or international management. In natural sciences, we have the ability to quantify relationships. For example, in a typical chemistry class, you will learn that such and such percentage of one component plus such and such percentage of second component will produce a third component. So it's very exact, it's very clear, and quantified. That is very typical about science in natural sciences. In social sciences, we do not have that ability. In other words, I cannot give you a formula which says 30% culture plus 70% biology gives you emotions. Maybe this is where we're going in the future. I hope not, personally. But that is the key difference. So now I want to go back to the question. To what extent do you believe that human emotion is shaped by biology or by culture? Both culture and biology play a very important role. Biology incorporates emotions and triggers emotions for very important reason: survival. So think about the emotion of fear. Why do we have this emotion? Well, it's because to protect us. When you see a big animal coming at you, the biology starts triggering in and telling us, hey, you must fear this and run away. Or anger, or happiness. These are emotions that have a big biological root, which means they are important for our survival over generations of human beings. So that's the relevance of biology. However, culture also plays a big role in development, definition, and display of emotions. Why? Because we remember what culture is. Culture is a set of rules, as a set of ways of doing things that people learn as they grow up in their society, as they interact with people from their society. So, if I grow up as a child in a part of the world where specific emotions are very important, then that becomes natural to me. That is how I will display my emotions. I'm going to give you a very specific example. Funerals. Funerals are a situation where people are sad. So sadness as an emotion is the key part of a funeral. Now, what is the role of culture? Well, if you are from Nordic Europe, you grow up learning that displaying big emotions is really not very acceptable. It makes you look bad. So, in a typical Nordic European funeral, people are somber, calm, quiet. So they display their sadness by being quiet and some facial expressions. Nothing more. Now let's go to the Middle East. In a typical Middle Eastern funeral, you see the greatest level of display of emotions in a funeral. Because in those cultures, crying very loud, showing huge amount of emotions is quite acceptable. In fact, it is expected. So if somebody is calm and quiet with very little facial expressions, everybody is going to think, what the hell is wrong with this person? He or she wanted the dead person to die, so are they happy about it? So the culture of displaying your sadness in a very, very big way is quite present in the typical Middle Eastern environment. So that is the role of culture. So sadness or fear or happiness have biological roots because they help us survive. But then as we survive and live our lives in our cultures, those unwritten ways of doing things, unwritten rules, teach us how to display those biologically rooted emotions. And I used this example of a funeral to contrast and juxtapose two very different cultures when it comes to emotional display. Okay, let's go to the next question. How fixed are emotions? If one moves to another culture, to what extent might their antecedents change over time? How has your view of emotions evolved over time? The emotions are quite fixed as long as you live in your own culture. Display of emotions is extremely important in any society. So as long as the person is growing up, is living, is experiencing life in their own culture, that's all they know. They're not exposed to any other variation or alternative forms of emotional display. So in their mind, that's the only way to do things. Now, once the person is exposed to diversity, in other words, living in other parts of the world, working with people from other parts of the world, then what happens is the person is now exposed to different displays, different display rules, different interpretations of emotions. Question is, what's the impact of that? The answer is it depends on a number of things. Number one, it depends on the length of time and intensity of exposure. For example, if I'm from the Middle East and I spend a week in Sweden, I may observe some emotions that are very different from mine, and I'll probably look at them and say, wow, that's very strange. I don't know why these people do these things. And then I forget about it because I'm only there for 1 week. So if you're a traveler to different parts of the world for short periods of time, the impact is very little. You'll probably be surprised at the display rules, but then nothing happens. However, if I am from the Middle East and I live in a Nordic European country for a long period of time and I work there, which is the case of Simin's, that the interview that you watched, that's where you see initial surprise, initial confusion, and then over time, adjustment. So the lengthier, the longer the period of exposure, and the more intensive the exposure, the interaction with people from other parts of the world. For example, Simin was always confused. Why is it that her colleagues are so cold, unemotional? Well, they weren't cold in their own minds because that's how they grew up. But Simin grew up in a culture where if you are my colleague, I socialize with you a lot. We spend a lot of time chatting about things, small talk, family talk. So she moved in this environment, which is very different. And initially, she really had a hard time figuring out what's wrong with these people. But over time, she realized that, well, you know, people do different things differently in different parts of the world. Now, there is a third element in terms of the extent of impact. So length of exposure, intensity of exposure, and the third element is the personality of the individual. Some individuals are more open-minded, are more willing to change things, are more willing to adjust and adapt. They're just more flexible, adaptable individuals. Some individuals tend to be very rigid and like stability. They don't like change. So the same level of exposure, the same intensity, the same length of time, if you are a rigid person, you will find it harder and more painful to make the change. If you are a more flexible person, you will adjust more quickly, you will enjoy it. It doesn't mean it's easy, but you will find it enjoyable, interesting, curious, and therefore you will show greater adjustment. So I've taken a little bit of time to explain this answer because it's really important. Emotions are fixed as long as you are in your own country. Because if you behave otherwise, your own fellow citizens are going to look at you and say, what's wrong with you? Why are you behaving in a strange way? So they're fixed as long as you're in your own culture. If you are exposed in some way or the other to other cultures, the extent of change in your emotions will depend on three things: the length of time, intensity of exposure, and your own personality. Okay. There is a second part to this question. How has your view of emotions evolved over time? This is a really interesting question, because I've lived, I was born in Iran. I left the country when I was 19 years old. I've lived in multiple countries, US, Singapore, Turkey, Canada, and a couple of other places. So throughout my life, I've been constantly exposed to diversity, and I'm the kind of person who enjoys that. I'm curious about things, and I don't find it difficult to adjust. So my own definition and interpretation of emotions has really been impacted by my own life experience. I have watched people in weddings, in funerals, in day-to-day interactions in different countries, and how different they can be. So nothing really surprises me. I'm open to how different things are done. All right, let's go to the next question. When someone is from a multicultural background, would they have multiple sets of display rules and choose the set of rules that is most appropriate? Or would they navigate social situations and have their own interpretation of display rules that would be culturally appropriate in multiple contexts? I'm going to use my own example. I have multiple display rules at my disposal. When I'm in China working with Chinese managers, I have an understanding of Chinese rules of display. Very respectful, very polite, somewhat distant, and very formal. When I'm in any Latin American country, I know the importance of emotions in human relations. So, contrary to the Chinese, Argentinians are full of emotions. Any conversation, emotions are expressed. When I'm in Nordic Europe, I know something about their ways of doing things. Or in North America, or in Germany, which is another culture where expressing emotions is looked down at. So I have this package, think of it as a toolkit. So you develop a toolkit. In that toolbox, there's a number of display rules. And you kind of, depending on what part of the world you're in, you go inside the toolkit, you bring it out, and you use it. So that's my answer, that people who are experienced in different parts of the world have developed a collection of display rules, and they behave according to those display rules. In fact, in one of the articles I wrote a few years ago, I made the point that if you are a global manager, you should think a global manager who travels to different parts of the world, who works with people from different parts of the world, you should think of yourself as an actor with a script. So depending on what part of the world you're in, you need a script. The same way that an actor needs a script. That script is what's in the toolbox. So in India, in China, in US, in Saudi Arabia, there should be a script about what's acceptable communication style, what's acceptable expression of emotions, and then use that information when you are traveling or spending time or interacting with people from that part of the world. All right, let's go to the next question. If you are uncertain of the display rules in a culture, is there a range of emotions that would be appropriate in multiple contexts? My first rule, kind of rule of thumb in answer to this question is, when you are in an unfamiliar environment, you need to be observant. You need to pay attention. You need to, first of all, remind yourself of your own display rules. This is really important because we actually take it for granted. We don't pay attention. It's like breathing. We don't pay attention to our breathing. Therefore, we don't pay attention to our display rules, our own culturally rooted display rules. So, when I'm in an unfamiliar environment, the first thing I need to do is remind myself that, I'm used to do things in these ways. So when I'm in a wedding or in a very happy environment, I'm used to showing a lot of expressions. I remind myself of that. The second thing to do is to now observe, pay attention to how the people in the new environment that I'm facing are behaving. What are their display rules? Because by observing, we learn what those rules are. The third thing that's important is I am not going to do what I naturally do in a new environment. Remember, my point number one was be aware of your own display rule. So the third point is don't automatically do what you've always done in your own home culture. Instead, be quiet, be calm, pay attention, learn. And there's nothing wrong, by the way, and I always do this. There's nothing wrong by telling people, hey, I'm new in this environment. I'd like to learn. Help me learn. No culture reacts negatively to people who show humility, who show interest in their culture. So I am perfectly natural when I come out and say, this is a new environment to me. I love to learn, so I'm going to watch. Please help me, teach me a few things about the display rules or any other aspect of your culture. I'm curious. I want to learn. So that's my third suggestion, that show curiosity and interest. The fourth suggestion I have is do not judge. Do not make judgment about how things are done in the culture that you are now brand new in. Why? Because if you make a judgment, you are really using your own display rules, your own cultural norms as your yardstick, which is exactly what you don't want to do in a different cultural environment. It's not about making judgment about other people. It's about understanding it. So those are the four things that have always served me very well and the managers that I work with. If you follow these four things, you are very likely to have an enjoyable experience. All right, let's go to the next question. Are there any books you would recommend to learn more about the topic of culture and emotions? Yes. There's a brand new book out. It's called The Emotional Mind. The Emotional Mind. It just came out in April of 2019, and it's all about the connection between culture and emotions. And you can purchase it on Amazon. So that'd be my suggestion. Next question. What are your thoughts on someone who is looking to change industry after 5.5 years in the same industry? This is really a very broad question, so there are many different angles to it. I will try to answer it from a couple of different perspectives. The first thought I have in response to this question is, what are some other industries that my capabilities, my experience would be suitable for? So if I'm in the banking industry and I'm now thinking of moving out in a different industry, the first question that I need to answer is, what are other industries where my capabilities, skills, and experience would be valued? So that's the first question, first thought that would come to my mind. The second thought would be, you need to understand that once you change industry, you are facing diversity. Remember, every industry has its own culture. So if you happen to be in investment banking has its own very specific, peculiar culture. People do things in specific ways. For example, risk-taking is an absolute part of investment banking. Now, if I want to go and work in a commercial bank, a typical bank that does consumer retail banking business, avoiding risk is a critical part of that culture. So now, as someone who's spent 5.5 years in one industry, has learned the rules of the game in that particular industry culture, now I'm shifting to an industry where the rules of the game could be quite different. The types of people I deal with may be quite different. In investment banking, many other people I interact with could be quite sophisticated financial types. They're very knowledgeable. In retail banking, many people may be quite uninformed, inexperienced about the stuff that I do. So how do I adjust from working with a group of clients or stakeholders who are very knowledgeable and sophisticated to an industry where the stakeholders and the people I deal with are not very sophisticated? I need to change my own ways of doing things, which brings me to the third point about flexibility and adaptability. Again, some individuals, personality-wise, are more open, more willing to adapt and change, and some are not. So that raises another question. Am I the kind of person who will feel comfortable in an environment where I have to learn the rules again. I have to spend quite a bit of time figuring out how are things done in this industry. Some people will say yes, some people say no to that question. So those are my thoughts about changing industry. By the way, a related issue is how globally exposed is my current industry, and how globally exposed is the industry that I may join. If my current industry is not globally exposed, and the industry I'm going to move into is very globally exposed, then I have to learn a lot of stuff about cultural issues, the kinds of things that we cover in this course. So that's another angle to the flexibility, adaptability, and learning that needs to take place. All right, let's go to the next question. What are your thoughts on the tech industry and how it aligns with other industries? You know, what amazes me is I travel to many countries. Many of them are developing countries. And I watch sometimes homeless people on the street using their iPhones. I find that fascinating. In other words, the key issue or advantage or feature of the tech industry is how it has permeated our lives. If you're driving a car, you're touching the tech industry. In fact, an automobile is now the greatest user of computer chips as a product. If you're watching a TV, you are touching some really fancy technology that's created by the tech industry. If you're calling someone, if you are on a treadmill in a fitness club, you are touching high-tech stuff. So a very critical feature of high-tech industry is how it has become a part of our life, daily life. Every minute, think about this. What would your life be today if you had no access to a computer or laptop and you had no access to a cell phone? To many people, it's actually unthinkable. Well, some of us lived in environments, in periods where there was no cell phone and there was no computer. I actually think back and I ask myself, how the hell did we manage? But we did. But the life today is impossible without high tech. You cannot survive. So, given the importance and the extent of permeation that high-tech industry, by the way, if today high-tech industry permeates our life to a big way, imagine what it's going to be like 10 years from now. All this talk about driverless cars, the way that high-tech industry is changing medicine and healthcare. So the extent of control that the high-tech industry will have over every one of us has nowhere to go but up. Our lives will be increasingly dependent on high-tech. So by definition, high-tech industry is global. High-tech industry is embedded in many other industries, many other products that we may not even think of them as a high-tech product, but they are because they're using the components or whatever it is that the high-tech industry produces. So it's if not the most, it is one of the most globally exposed industries in the world. Which brings me to the question of, so what are the implications of that for people who work in that industry? To me, if you want to be a successful manager in the high-tech industry, you really need to master the art of managing diversity. Diversity in terms of the clients you deal with, stakeholders you deal with, diversity in terms of the cultures of people in different parts of the world that you deal with. So it is an industry where for you to succeed, it's not just about your technical skills. They're critical, of course, but they're not sufficient. On top of that, you need to understand how it interacts with clients, customers, individuals, stakeholders, across industries and across cultures. All right. Next question. What is the best type of internship that you would recommend after an undergraduate versus graduate program? Well, again, this is a very open-ended and very general question. So I'm going to take it from the point of view of this course. Remember, this is a course in cross-cultural communication. So to me, an internship program of any sort has to offer two features. One, it has to offer the ability, the opportunity for the student to develop, to implement, to apply the skills that they've learned in classroom and develop new skills related to it. So, number one, it should be an opportunity for applying what you have learned. Number two, again, in the context of this course, number two, it should be an opportunity to be exposed to diversity, to be exposed to different ways of doing things. So if you are a mechanical engineer, if you graduate from a mechanical engineering, it would be a great opportunity for you to have an internship as a mechanical engineer working in another country, working for a firm or for an organization in another country. To me, that would be really ideal. It makes it a little harder, I have to admit. It adds a layer of complexity. But then it's a really valuable learning opportunity. All right. Thank you for sharing the interview with Ms. Simin Saifzadeh, because I personally gained the benefit from the lecture. How does someone maintain a good cultural practice? Well, thank you for your feedback. I'm glad to hear that the interview was helpful to you. I created that interview because I wanted all of you to experience life through the eyes of a person who has actually experienced it. I wanted you to feel, to understand, to witness the challenges that a person faces when they go through different cultural experiences. I've talked about it in my sessions, lectures, but I wanted you to see it in real life. So, I'm glad to hear that it was helpful. Second part of the question was, how does someone maintain a good cultural practice? If you want to maintain a good cultural practice, step number one is to be open-minded. As an individual, to have passion for learning, to see new and different ways of things, not as a threat or not as something wrong, but as an opportunity for you to learn something different. So curiosity and learning orientation is really important. Number two, when you are a curious person, when you have a learning orientation, what do? You learn. So read, go to websites, talk to people from different parts of the world. Go and try food in different ethnic restaurants in your city. If you are at the university, if you're a student, go and find a bunch of students from different parts of the world. If you are working for an organization, go and find some colleagues from different parts of the world. So to develop this good cultural practice, you need to have the learning orientation or the curiosity and the willingness to take the time to expose yourself. The least threatening type of exposure is reading a book, watching a website, reading a website, or watching movies from different parts of the world. A little more threatening is going to restaurants and trying different foods, ethnic foods, some of which you may not like, some of which you may find strange. So it's a little more threatening in that sense. And the next level of threatening is when you spend time with people from different parts of the world. Threatening in the sense that you may see things that and hear things that may be very different and very unusual to you. And that's perfectly fine. If you have curiosity, you enjoy that. You search for it. Because if you don't search for it, it's not coming after you. You're the one who needs to take the initiative. Let me use this course as an example. My understanding is that, and I'm going to check with my colleagues here, my understanding is that we have learners from over 100 countries.
Yes.
In this course.
Yes.
Now think about that. Guys, ladies, 100 countries are represented in this course. So how many learners from different countries have you already contacted? Now, you know that as part of the course, I created an excuse. I forced you through the building of the teams, I forced you to be in touch and work with someone from another country. Initially, you may have thought, this is painful. Why are you doing this? It's taking a lot of time for me to find someone. But now you know why I did it. But don't stop there. You have access to people from over 100 countries right now. So how many are you going to contact? Which countries are you interested in? How many new friends do you want to have? This course is giving you all of that opportunity. Enjoy. All right. Let's move on to the next question. what are the differences between active listening and hearing someone? How can we integrate active listening across different cultures? As you know by now, active listening is really a critical part of management, of communication. When I ask people, what do you think is the most important objective when you're communicating with someone else? The most frequent response I get is, well, the objective is to make sure they understand me. To which I respond, no, the objective should be to make sure you understand them. Most people define effective communication as you understand me. I don't think that's the right way. To me, the most important objective of communication is, do I understand you? Which means I gotta listen. Now, what does active listening mean? Active listening means you minimize disruptions. You minimize anything that takes your mind away from the person or the people you're communicating with, you're talking with, you're listening to. So, no cell phone, no daydreaming. Active listening also means patience. You know, when I've asked hundreds, if not thousands, I've asked hundreds of managers, what is your biggest obstacle when you're communicating with someone and when you're listening to someone? You know, the number one answer is, I get impatient. I try to complete the other person's sentence. The other person is in the middle of his or her talk, and I've already reached my conclusion. That's what I mean by patience. Show respect to the other. Doesn't mean you agree with them. You may totally disagree with them, but you got to show them respect by being calm and attentive and being patient, not jumping into conclusion, not thinking, oh, how am I going to respond to this person? She's in the middle of her sentence and I already have my response. That's impatience. That's also a lack of respect. So if you want to be an active listener, you minimize any other thing that stops you from focusing on the other person and the message that the other person is communicating. All right, and by the way, I hope you are being active listeners right now, paying attention to me. Okay, so that brings me to the last question. Can you please review the overall themes within the GMI report? Well, I have a couple of minutes, so I'm going to give you a little more detail about that report. You all know by now that global mindset consists of three major dimensions. An intellectual side that we call intellectual capital, a psychological side, which we call psychological capital, and a behavioral side, which we call social capital. So, intellectual side is what you know. How knowledgeable are you about how to do business in different parts of the world, your knowledge about the political systems in other parts of the world, your knowledge about competition, markets, etc., in different parts of the world. So it's all cognitive, what you know. Psychological side is about how you react, your emotions, how you react to all of that. Are you curious? Do you enjoy being in the middle of people from different parts of the world? Do you enjoy traveling? Do you have a sense of adventure? Are you okay with taking some risk and tolerating novel, unfamiliar, strange things? Because that's what's going to happen to you when you're dealing in global environments. Behavioral side or social capital is all about how you actually behave. So how do you communicate with people from other parts of the world? Do you understand nonverbal communication? Do you understand how emotions play a role in communication in different parts of the world? Are you a good listener? Do you have experience negotiating agreements, contracts with people from different parts of the world? So it's all about things you do. And combined, these three elements is what we call global mindset. Now, in the report, we show you your score on each one of these elements. So each dimension has three elements. Intellectual capital has three elements. Psychological capital has three elements. And social capital has three elements. We show you in your report your score on any of these elements. Now, I'm going to spend a couple of minutes on how to interpret the scores. If your score on any of these elements is 4 and above, somewhere between 4 and 5, as you know, the scale is 1 to 5. If your score on any of them is between 4 and 5, that means you're very good at it in your own mind, because remember, this is self-assessment. There's also a version of the instrument where other people get to assess you. But the instrument that was available to you is your own self-assessment. So that means in your own mind, you have a strong suit. If your score is between 3 and 4, that means you're doing okay. There are many things you can do to improve if you wish to, but you're doing okay. If your score is 3 or below, you need to ask yourself 2 questions. The first question is, if you are employed right now, how relevant is that particular element, for example, knowledge of global business? How relevant is that to what you're doing in your job right now? If your answer is yes, it's very important, then you need to make plans for improvement. If your answer is no, in what I'm doing right now is not important, then the next question for you is, where do you want to be 5 years from now? What kind of a job? What kind of an organization? And how relevant is that particular element to your success 5 years from now? If the answer is it's not relevant, then forget about it. Having a low score on it doesn't mean anything, nothing to worry about, because it's not relevant to what you do. If your answer is yes, it's not relevant right now, but going forward, because of my job, because of my company, etc., it's going to be relevant. Then you need to make plans for improvement. Now, if you don't have a job, if you're not employed right now, you can ask the same, and your score is 3 or below, you can still ask the same questions. What kind of a job do you want to have? And how relevant is this particular dimension or element to that particular job? If you decide that, oh, it's going to be very relevant, then you need to make plans for improvement. So my point is, a low score on any of these elements does not automatically mean you're hopeless. It means you need to put it in the context of your own priorities, personal priorities, professional priorities, what you're doing now, what kind of a person you want to be, what kind of a manager you want to be, what kind of an employee you want to be. In that context, you decide whether a low score means you need to make improvement or you ignore it. That's totally up to you. So there you have it, a little bit of a summary of how to interpret your own scores. That brings me to the end of the questions I have. Let me ask my colleagues if there's anything else that I need to cover.
There are no further questions.
All right, very good. Well, so this brings me to the end of the session. Thank you again for taking the time to send us your questions. These are all very thoughtful questions. I really appreciate that. And I look forward to the next set of questions. Thank you again for making the time to either be present right now or watch this video at a later time. And I hope you find it helpful. And again, if my talk today prompted new additional questions in your mind, don't be shy. Send it to us, and we'll do our best to respond. Thank you, and good luck. Bye-bye.